This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former Secretary of State, former Attorney General Rufus Edmisten, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, author and syndicated columnist John Hood, and former Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr. Well, welcome to this Valentine's Day edition. It's been a week filled with lots of news, and we want to talk about two recent court decisions on redistricting and another on separation of powers. Plus, we'll discuss how the New Hampshire presidential primary might impact North Carolina. And, of course, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. So let's get started. A special panel of 3 federal judges ruled that North Carolina congressional districts 1 and 12 are drawn so as to ensure the majority of voters were black. The court demanded that the maps be redrawn within 2 weeks. Judge Roger Gregory wrote for the court, "There is strong evidence that race was the only non-negotiable criterion and that traditional redistricting principles were subordinated to race. In fact, the overwhelming evidence in this case shows that a percentage floor or racial quota was established in both Congressional District 1 and Congressional District 12, and that floor could not be compromised." The state filed for a stay to that verdict, but on Tuesday the court refused to grant the stay, so then the state filed an emergency appeal for a stay to the Supreme Court. Bob Orr, as a former state Supreme Court justice, let me ask, what happens if the Supremes grant the stay, and what happens if they don't?
Well, first, I should say that there is an appeal on the merits that is going to the Supreme Court regardless. If a stay is granted, which means the order is held in abeyance, then congressional elections under the old maps will go forward for this election cycle. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Court denies the stay, then the legislature has 2 weeks to draw new maps. They have to be approved by the 3-judge panel, and then the election machinery would have to be retooled to reflect the new maps.
Rufus, hearing what Bob said, on what grounds might the Supreme Court make a decision to grant the stay?
Well, of course, the absentee ballot question. I might point out that the great philosopher Yogi Berra said that it's deja vu all over again. I recall in my tenure as Attorney General, this has happened over and over again. And frankly, the Supreme Court doesn't seem to care what kind of emergency you have. And I think that it's a false notion, in my opinion. Political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering are both equally bad, and it only proves one thing, that we need to get on with the business of creating a nonpartisan redistricting commission.
Chris, the issue of these absentee ballots, how compelling a reason would that be for the court to grant a stay?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, some people have voted. I was sort of surprised at the State Board of Elections. I mean, the current state is a U.S. court has said, we find these districts to be unconstitutional. And that means that the election has to be held. These districts have to be redrawn so the districts aren't current, and yet the State Board of Elections was still telling people, go ahead and vote if you have an absentee ballot, which I thought was sort of interesting. But it doesn't mean these people won't have a chance to vote. They may just have a chance to vote in a new election with new districts. But clearly that's going to be the argument by the state, that this election is already underway and that the stay should be issued to let it continue.
John, back to what Justice Orr said. If the Supreme Court refuses to grant the stay, the legislature is going to come back into session this coming week and is going to redraw the districts. Now, they won't just be redrawing District 1 and District 12, will they? They're going to, isn't that going to affect all other districts around?
By definition, if you redraw the district, it affects the surrounding districts. The principle, the conflict between Supreme Court cases, the Strickland case, the more recent case out of Alabama, that's a big issue. That's a big legal issue. At some point, if the U.S. Supreme Court were to actually figure out what it wants and what it will do, then the rest of the states can actually follow the rules that keep changing all the time. But separate from that, people want to know, well, what's the effects on the Democrats and the Republicans, and is this going to give the Democrats more of a chance to win? No. The practical effect is going to be very, very small. The Republicans have plenty of other ways to draw these districts that would be more compact, that would where the minority percentage might be 45% instead of 50.7%. The practical effect will be very small. The real issue is, what is the precedent? What does the Voting Rights Act mean in the modern context? Does it mean that plaintiffs can keep going to the court and asking judges to redraw districts so they can help their political party? Is that what it means? Because if it does, then that's a mess. But if it doesn't, and we actually get out of the business of drawing race-conscious districts, then the districts can actually be rational. But until then, they will always look like ink spots.
I want to go back to Bob, though. Help us walk through this process. If the court, if the legislature has to redraw the districts.
Right.
All right, so what's the process there? Do they go back to that three-judge panel for approval, or to the Justice Department, or both?
No, they'll go back to the three-judge panel to see if the new maps comply with the instructions and order that the three-judge panel has initially submitted. But I want to, if I could, Tom, John's exactly right about the mess that the jurisprudence is in when it comes to redistricting, and Rufus is exactly right.
Well, it's not very prudent jurisprudence, is it?
Well, I mean, you know, it's all over the place.
I like that when Rufus is right. I want to hear that.
But Rufus is right. Until the U.S. Supreme Court says that political gerrymandering is unconstitutional, you know, we're going to continue to have these redistricting fights. And you know what? We're only 2 election cycles away from a whole new series of redistricting.
You get about the same results with political redistricting as you do racial redistricting. And short of a stay, there's no way the State Board of Elections can get ready no matter what they do. So if you don't get a stay, you will not be voting in those districts.
A very good example of the muddle and the confusion that the federal judiciary has created is the decision that was put out. There was a ruling that 2 of the 3 judges agreed to in total, and 1 judge agreed to in part. And then there was a concurring opinion. Now, the ruling was that the Republicans did something wrong because they used race. Now, it would have been okay if they'd done political gerrymandering, but if they used race, that was bad. The concurring opinion was political gerrymandering is bad. Now, that makes no sense. That you cannot possibly reconcile these positions.
It is bad because they get about the same result.
Look, I agree that it's bad, but it is idiotic to say it's okay to use political gerrymandering instead of racial gerrymandering. Oh, and political gerrymandering is an outrage.
It is.
From the same judges.
All right, so, Chris, let's again follow through this process. If we are unable to hold, and if we have to go back and redraw the districts, would everybody agree it's fairly unlikely we'll be able to do that and hold congressional primaries in March?
No way.
All right, so if that is indeed the case, when will we hold these congressional primaries?
Well, I don't know. We used to have a primary in May. Maybe that would still work.
Well, there's a runoff date for the March primaries, and maybe the runoff date could be used. I think that's been done before, where you had to redraw some districts, and so a initial primary was held on a date where others were holding runoffs.
We've had elections on Labor Day, in September before because of redistricting challenges, and I hope one of the outcomes of this is to get, it's not just that the Supreme Court has to say political gerrymandering is wrong. The legislature can say it by setting up a commission, and maybe this mess at some point will finally get to the point where the public will demand that.
And how long are you going to hold your breath?
Well, I'll hold my breath until Phil Berger, who introduced the bill 5 times in a row, finally comes back to his original plan.
The wild card is that I understand in April the trial starts on the legislative districts, and the same issue is there. So
probably not the same 3 judges, though.
No, it's 3 different judges, but
this is the key principle that will, and the legislative map is much more likely to be affected in a partisan sense than the congressional, in my opinion.
But by that time, though, the legislative primaries will have already been held.
Well, in my tenure, Tom, we had elections all over the place, all the time, because of this very thing. And I would hope that someday the 12th district will not be the nation's worst redistricted salamander in America.
Well, the first isn't that much worse, much better. Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or NC Spin on Twitter. When we come back, the Supreme Court rules on separation of powers.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I want an attorney general that supports law enforcement, and that's why I back Buck.
North Carolina needs leaders. That's why I back Buck.
I believe in the Second Amendment, and that's why I back Buck.
In the upcoming Republican primary, back Buck. Buck Newton for Attorney General.
Let's prepare our state for the future by supporting the Connect NC bond. The bond will fund smart investments in education, agriculture, state parks, our National Guard, and infrastructure projects, creating job opportunities, strengthening our workforce, and driving innovation. It's a timely investment and a smart one for North Carolina families. On March 15th, stand with Farm Bureau and vote for the Connect NC bond.
We now return to NC Spin.
When the North Carolina legislature created commissions to oversee coal ash cleanup and some other ones like it, they also appointed the majority of members of those boards and commissions. Governor McCrory, joined by former Governors Hunt and Martin, sued, saying the legislature had overstepped their authority and breached the separation of powers in our Constitution. Our Supreme Court recently ruled in favor of the governors, saying when the General Assembly appoints executive officers that the governor has little power to remove, it can appoint them essentially without the governor's influence. That leaves the governor with little control over the views and priorities of the officers in that the General Assembly appoints. Question one to Rufus. You served many years as our Attorney General. While the court ruled in favor of the governor on 3 boards and commissions, it stopped short of saying the legislature couldn't make any appointments to those boards. What implications does this decision have, and particularly on the appointive process of other state boards and commissions?
In my opinion, tremendous implications. If I may go back and brag just a tiny bit, in 1982 I gave a ruling to Liston Ramsey that the Advisory Budget Commission was basically an executive function. They had no business being on there.
And that led to the downfall of the ABC.
And it led to the downfall of the ABC. And then another decision that Justice Orr recalled was Wallace v. Bone about the Environmental Management Commission, which said if you even put 4 of them on that board, it had such extreme legislative and administrative functions that they couldn't be on there. And so I think, and I remember giving a list back in '82 of all the boards that I thought were under suspicion, and they agreed with me, Jerry Cohen, and I think right now that there are going to be a lot of boards and commissions that will be questioned, and I would say beware, because some of these decisions that are handed down by some of these boards that are legislatively constituted are not going to stand.
Bob Moore, Chief Justice Mark Martin said on this ruling, we cannot adopt a categorical rule that would resolve every separation of powers challenge to the legislative appointment of executive powers. What was he saying and what wasn't he saying there?
Well, judicial restraint says you only answer the questions that have been presented to the court. You don't answer all the questions that people might have. So in that respect, they answered the question about the 3 commissions at issue. But they did lay down a fairly clear and cogent test to apply as to whether legislative appointments, and clearly a majority of legislative appointments to a board with final executive authority that limited the governor's ability to control them, was not going to meet the standard of separation of powers. It's a very, very substantial decision. Yes.
Jerry Cohen, Chris, who we both know was served for many years as chief bill drafter over at the legislature, said, I would think that any board other than the UNC Board of Governors that carries out executive functions is at risk here if the legislature makes the majority of appointments. Does this mean we can expect more lawsuits, or do you think that the legislature will just fall in line and comply?
Well, I don't think the legislature normally falls in line and complies, but it does seem pretty clear what the court thinks needs to happen. I would hope that they would fall in line and comply. And while we're at it, I think we ought to take a look at the Board of Governors. I mean, I think that's
a different horse.
It is a different horse, but I think
we have to redo the Constitution.
Right, we have to redo the Constitution. But I do think this is a fascinating debate, and I do think that the court was right, and I hope that the legislature does follow the order.
John, for all intents and purposes, this Coal Ash Commission, as well as 2 other ones, including mining and oil exploration, has had their work just effectively halted. What's it going to take to put them back in business and get them going so far as the tasks that they were assigned?
The commissions, the legislation authorizing the commissions will need to be redone to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling, which I agree with Bob. They did not lay down an explicit test. There is an obvious implicit test. And the issue is not just who appointed the members to the commissions. The argument that was made that the majority of the justices agreed with is that because the members, once they're appointed, are not under no one's supervision in the executive branch, they cannot be removed by the executive branch. In effect, you reduce that to out of the problem if a majority of the committee's appointees come from the governor. So I just think they need to redo the authorization, but not just for those commissions. They need to go ahead and proactively fix a lot of others.
Rufus, I want to ask you and Bob, has this lawsuit effectively clarified the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branch?
Well, no, it never will. Well, you got to go back to the history of North Carolina, that we were very fearful of executive power. The legislature has always been dominant in North Carolina, and he's right. The three tests: who appoints, who supervises, and who removes. That's a little bit clearer, I think, than John mentioned, and I think you got to take it case by case.
Bob, your comment on that?
Well, it is a case-by-case determination, but two things. One, the governor and the legislative leadership need to sit down in private and resolve this so you don't have a plethora of lawsuits down the road. And secondly, there's some fascinating issues left hanging about independent boards, like the Board of Elections. You know, the governor has very limited authority over the Board of Elections. And so is it an executive branch board? Should the governor have more authority, say, to remove members? I mean, there are a lot of questions that aren't answered that
well, one of them you alluded to, and I'll ask John and Chris, I got 30 seconds to answer this. How's this verdict going to impact the future working relationship between the governor and the legislature?
Believe it or not, I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot. I think both sides had conversations. They had disagreed about this very big sweeping decision, but had agreed to live by whatever the Supreme Court came up with. I think the Supreme Court split the difference in favor of the governor. Remember, both sides made kind of extreme arguments. The Supreme Court split the difference in favor of the governor's position.
Chris?
Well, I don't disagree entirely with that, but I find it fascinating, as I've mentioned before on the show, that the General Assembly refused to make the governor's appointments to other boards. For example, the State Board of Education, which wasn't involved in the decision at all. So the people have been robbed of 2 members of that board to help make education policy. So I'm not so sure the legislature will be accommodating all
right, after these messages, we're going to talk about the presidential beauty pageant, how it affects North Carolina.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I still believe in the Constitution. That's why I back Buck.
I believe in the Second Amendment. That's why I back Buck.
I want someone who puts North Carolina first. That's why I back Buck.
In the upcoming Republican primary, back Buck. Buck Newton for Attorney General.
Connect NC, a bond initiative that makes vital investments in North Carolina without raising taxes.
Connect NC is about investing in our future.
It will create better job training opportunities for the 21st century.
It will make our state safer and better prepared.
It invests in North Carolina's community colleges and our future.
And expand cutting-edge research to strengthen our ag community.
All without raising taxes.
No tax increases.
Please join me in supporting Connect NC.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at OurNCHealthcare.com.
Connect NC, a bond initiative that makes vital investments in North Carolina without raising taxes.
Connect NC is about investing in our future.
It will create better job training opportunities for the 21st century.
It will make our state safer and better prepared.
It invests in North Carolina's community colleges and our future.
And expand cutting-edge research to strengthen our ag community.
All without raising taxes.
No tax increases.
Please join me in supporting Connect NC.
Now now return to NC Spin.
We now know the results of both Iowa and New Hampshire's elections. The Republican field is narrowing while the Democratic race is tightening, with South Carolina's GOP primary vote being held this coming Saturday. We want to get our panel to discuss the implications to North Carolina. I'm going to ask all of you, give us your assessment as to where things now stand. John?
Well, quite literally, on the Democratic side, Sanders has 36 delegates and Clinton has 32. And on the Republican side, Trump has 17, Cruz has 11, Rubio has 10, Kasich has 5, Bush has 4. It's important to keep in mind this is a contest for delegates. It's not just looking at the media spin.
Not just a beauty pageant.
There are differences in the vote totals. It might be 1,000 votes or something. In practical terms, they don't matter.
All right, John, Bob Orr, we've got to issue a disclaimer here. You're John Kasich's state campaign co-chair, but where do you think things now stand?
Well, I think most of the campaigns on the Republican side are waiting to see what happens over the next series of primaries through March 1 before they do a heavy primaries. Yeah, before they do a heavy investment in North Carolina. I think depending on how those come out will depend on whether we see a lot of presidential candidates.
Rufus?
Here.
Well, I want to quote the eminent scholar on the panel here, John Hood, who a couple weeks ago said that New Hampshire produced us a socialist and a sociopath. Now, that's come right out of his mouth. And I don't think these two states, Iowa and New Hampshire, have a hill of beans worth of impact on North Carolina. They don't represent America at all. North Carolina is still not that big a player yet.
Except no president has ever been elected that hadn't finished first or second in New Hampshire. And I know things could change because this is a wacky year, but it's not. They do have a big impact. It's not just about delegates. Marco Rubio said his plan was to finish third in Iowa, second in New Hampshire, win South Carolina. He finished fifth in New Hampshire. So the big battle, of course, in the Republican Party is who's going to be the establishment candidate to challenge Donald Trump. I think the Democratic race will look much different as we head south, where Hillary Clinton has much stronger support. But I think the fact that the Republicans decided to make North Carolina a proportional state instead of winner-take-all makes it unlikely that especially with the other states going on at the same time, that we're going to see a huge effort in North Carolina from the Republicans.
So going through this, we've got the South Carolina primaries on March 1st. We got Super Tuesday.
We have Nevada in between.
And Nevada in between. So it's going to get down here. Are we going to continue to see the field narrowing, particularly
Absolutely.
in the GOP race?
I still think it'll eventually become a three-person race, Trump, Cruz, and probably Rubio. I think Trump still has a real challenge getting over the 50% mark, so I think it's still more likely than not that either Rubio or Cruz will defeat Trump. But we'll see how quickly the race narrows. As long as the race stays populated, the better off Trump is.
So who's North Carolina? The polls show Trump is ahead on the Republican side in North Carolina. Y'all think that's going to stay, or do you think that'll diminish by then?
I'm going to go with Bob's candidate.
John Kasich. Thank you.
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah. I think that it depends on how many candidates are left. Obviously, I think if it's a 2 or 3 person race, it's a lot harder. But I think Trump will be a significant player in the North Carolina primary.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Your family physician knows your health is more than just having a personal relationship with your doctor. You must have access to clean water. You need a place to exercise like our wonderful state parks. And we must ensure the healthcare and research workforce of the future. The North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians believes that when it comes to good health, we are all in this together. That's why we support the Connect NC bonds. Vote yes to invest on March 15th and vote for the Connect NC bond.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Let's prepare our state for the future by supporting the Connect NC bond. The bond will fund smart investments in education, agriculture, state parks, our National Guard, and infrastructure projects, creating job opportunities, strengthening our workforce, and driving innovation. It's a timely investment and a smart one for North Carolina families. On March 15th, stand with Farm Bureau and vote for the Connect NC bond.
We now return to NC Spin.
One of the best parts of our show, and you tell us this, is that when we ask the panelists to tell us something we don't know, they get to choose the topic. And Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
Well, we've already talked on the show about the Republican presidential primary. It's striking that we're seeing a little bit of that play out in North Carolina behind the scenes. Americans for Prosperity, a very conservative group, is attacking Republican state legislator Nelson Dollar for his votes. They're complaining about the budget that he passed in the House, which a lot of other Republicans voted for. There's still I think there's still disunity on the Republican side in the state House.
Rufus, tell us something we don't know.
I want to talk about Flora and Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell's a Renaissance man. For years, I've been on The Weekend Gardener as a participant on WPTF, AM 680, and Tom Campbell hosted that show for 2 Saturdays and did a fantastic job. He knows more about gardening than he will let on live.
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Bob
Moore, tell us something we don't know.
Well, I just spent the weekend in New Hampshire campaigning for John Kasich. The debates did him a great disservice. At town halls and in retail politicking, he's as good as you get.
And that's all right. John, tell us something we don't know.
If you look at party identification, not party registration, but how people identify themselves, the 2 states in the country with the closest balance between Democratic and Republican voters are Ohio and North Carolina. They both have almost exactly the same number of self-identified R's and D's. These are the 2 states you should watch to see what the direction of the country is going to be. North Carolina, Ohio.
So going back to our previous discussion, we got a little time left in show here. Going back to our previous discussion, North Carolina, March 15th, we're looking at this presidential primary and talking primarily about that. But are there any other interesting races that we need to be focusing on between now and then?
Lots.
I know there's some legislative races.
I would look at the Attorney General contest between Buck Newton, Jim O'Neill, and one other candidate. I would look at State Treasurer, Democratic primary between Ron Elmers and Dan Blue III. There are, as you said,
Elmer picked up a big endorsement this past week from the State Employees Association.
And Dan Blue got the NCAE, the North Carolina Association of Educators. I think the lieutenant governor's race on the Democratic side is interesting, where Linda Coleman is trying again. Holly Jones from Asheville is a strong candidate.
And Linda Coleman got an endorsement recently.
Yeah, but nobody's paying attention to these races.
No, they're not.
No, that's the problem.
And Bob, I know you're one of the co-chairs of the Connect NC bond campaign. Yeah. They ain't paying much attention to that either.
We're still counting on folks coming out to vote for it, including everybody at the table.
All right. Yeah. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.